In this video, I'll be talking about how Paul used implicit argumentation and irony in his response to the situation of the Thessalonians. If you haven't already, be sure to watch the first video in my series on 1 Thessalonians, where I reconstruct the teaching of Paul's opponents and the situation at Thessalonica. I will link to that video in the description below. By implicit argument, I mean an argument that can be inferred from contextual knowledge. This is in contrast to an explicit argument, which is a direct argument with claims and supporting reasoning and evidence. In order to understand an implicit argument, one must understand the contextual knowledge. But as I talked about in my last video, we are missing half of the context, and why it's so important to reconstruct what that context was. One way that Paul makes an implicit argument is by using terms in a way that was contrary to how his opponents used them. In my last video, I talked about how, for Paul's opponents, the terms Jesus, Jesus Christ, and Christ all had different meanings. In Paul's letter, he doesn't say explicitly that those terms are synonymous, but rather uses those terms in a way that was contrary to how his opponents used them. In the same way, Paul uses Lord and the Lord in ways that were contrary to his opponents. I'll explain in detail how he does this in future videos, where I'll be going through each chapter verse by verse. We see an example of Paul's implicit argumentation outside of 1 Thessalonians in Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, where he equates the deeds of the flesh with various terms of immorality. Paul here is using a rhetorical device known as an anthorism, which is a description or definition contrary to that which has been given by one's opponent. For Paul's opponents, the way of the flesh was good, being associated with keeping God's law. But Paul puts the flesh in a negative light, so much so that it might be considered irony. By irony, I mean the opposite of what's expected. But how do you know what the original reader expected? Once again, reconstructing the arguments of Paul's opponents and the situation in Thessalonica is critical in understanding Paul. In Isaiah, while describing God's wrath against his adversaries, it mentions righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation. In light of the teaching of Paul's opponents, who told the Thessalonians that they would experience this wrath of God if they didn't follow the way of the flesh, they would have expected this type of language in Isaiah to be associated with God's wrath. But Paul spins that expectation on its head and talks about the breastplate of faith and love and a helmet as the hope of salvation. The message of Paul's opponents emphasized a God of wrath if the Thessalonians didn't follow the way of the flesh. One way that Paul implicitly counters this is by referring to God as the God of peace near the end of his letter. Okay, so before I wrap up this video, I want to go over the big picture of how the way of the Spirit and the way of the flesh relate to Paul and the way. There are elements in each way that Paul agrees with and elements that he does not agree with. In his letter, Paul has to explain which elements overlap with his own teaching and which do not, although he rarely does this explicitly. If you followed the way of the Spirit, your God was Jesus Christ. If you followed the way of the flesh, your God was the God of Israel. In his letter, Paul brings God and Jesus Christ together in his argumentation. In the way of the Spirit, your Christ was a Christ in the Spirit. In the way of the flesh, your Christ was a Christ in the flesh. But Paul argues that Jesus is the Christ in the flesh. In the way of the Spirit, you had faith in Jesus Christ. In the way of the flesh, you followed God's law. Paul will emphasize faith and downplay the law. Paul and his opponents agreed that Jesus descended into Hades, but Paul emphasized that he was raised to life and ascended into heaven. In the way of the Spirit, you could obtain salvation of your spirit after death. In the way of the flesh, you could obtain salvation of both the spirit after death and the body during the day of the Lord. In the way of the Spirit, you were in darkness. In the way of the flesh, you were in light. Paul argues that the Thessalonians are in the light and not darkness. In the way of the Spirit, you would experience God's wrath on the day of the Lord. In the way of the flesh, you would be part of God's kingdom on earth. Paul argues that the Thessalonians were a part of God's kingdom and that they would not experience God's wrath. That's it for today. In my next video, I'll be going through chapter 1 verse by verse. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.